and welcome to lecture 3 on the culture course. Specifically today we're looking at intercultural communication in a business context, and you would be required to read chapters 5 to 7 for this lecture. The eagle eyes amongst you might see that I'm wearing the same clothes as yesterday. In fact, I'm not, it's still today. I'm just trying to get ahead of the curve, as they say nowadays. So bear with me. Today I want to talk about some of the things we're going to be doing just to clarify the tasks themselves. So firstly we're going to talk about the term paper and the culture and country presentations. Then we're going to look at organising messages to other cultures, non-verbal language and intercultural communication, which is a lot of fun actually, we'll have a laugh with that hopefully, and cultural rules for establishing relationships. So as you know, you have tutorials on Friday to discuss the first task, which is Seminar 1, presentations of business culture in different countries. By no means is that session mandatory, but I would advise that it's useful for you to discuss with me what it is you're doing, any questions about the course in general, or the term paper, as well as this. So, you know, if you can't make it individually, that's okay. Just make sure that your group have questions to ask, but it might be useful. But if you don't want to attend, that's okay too. If you're reading and you know where you are, that's all right. But you do have to attend Seminar 1. So, I'll go through this. We'll take advantage of the diversity of our module participants, and therefore the plethora of different cultures involved, by allowing groups to prepare a 20-minute presentation of a country, organisation or a region, or even a continent, and its culture, focusing on, incidentally, if you were here, I'd ask you, which countries are also continents? The answer to that is Australia. Anyway, focusing on the business context. There might be others, but I don't know of any. Anyway, you should discuss what you understand by the term culture. Now, this is me preparing you for thesis work and academic arguments and reports in general. You always want to define what you mean by a certain term. We've been through a plethora of different terms, definitions of culture, so you can find them for yourself. But basically, why do you do that? Well, whenever you use that word culture from here on in that presentation, everybody knows what it is specifically you mean by culture. So if you're examining it in a thesis, then you have a good idea as a reader of what you're examining specifically. For your chosen unit of analysis, that's also a very important research term. That is country, region, continent or ethnicities, and how such a culture may facilitate or hinder effective communication in business contexts. Describe the main assumptions about the people in that country or culture, what you think is important to know for people visiting in a business or vacation situation. Attendance to this is mandatory. Hopefully that's clear. This is a gentle introduction where I want you to be reading the material, reflecting on it and applying it in an analytical sense to a country of yours and your group's choice. Wonderful. We also want to talk briefly now about the final seminar, term paper assignment and the seminar. In this assignment, term paper assignment, your group will conduct a critical study of a topic within the area of business culture communication, which should be appropriate to the aims of the module. You have the aims of the module in the first lecture and in the course manual. You're free to choose any topic in consultation with the instructor, that's me. The aim of the assignment is to critically comment and reflect upon business culture from an international and or cross-cultural perspective. Your term paper should thus be related to the influence of culture and communication and how these in turn affect organisational strategies and policies. You're required to describe the purpose and the problem of the paper, as you will be in the thesis. Point out very shortly how you've conducted the study. It's not a method class, so it's going to be secondary data most likely, and I'm not interested in ontology and epistemology for this purpose, just we did some research online and found some interesting articles. I would suggest that you base the whole thing on an article. Perhaps it's something that you're very interested in from the point of view of the initial culture and country presentation. So you say, well, I'm interested in Japan. You do that presentation, then you say, well, I'm interested in Japan and a Japanese company. Perhaps then you say, well, I'm interested in Nissan and Renault, or something along those lines. Have a look around, read things, Time magazine and The Economist magazine and Dagens Nyheter and this kind of thing to find inspiration. You're required to describe the purpose of the problem, as I've said, point out very shortly how you've conducted it, as I've said, explain the theoretical framework on culture and communication, and analyse the process through which you confronted the topic, paying special attention to any relevant conclusions emerging from the comparisons of different theories or models. Ultimately, 8 to 10 pages and about 20-minute presentation at the end. Now, I kind of miss you, because it'd be so nice if you were here, you could ask questions, but do so in the tutorial. So bear that in mind, start thinking as a group what it is you want to do. Tip, I would, don't throw away the work you do on the first seminar. It might well be useful later, so bear it in mind. All right, hopefully that's sunk in. Then we can have a little look at the communication model, which is, I think, chapter 6. Meaning and communication. Now, these differ in different cultural contexts. The purpose and factors of communication. So why, who, where, and when ought communication in business be undertaken? The purpose and factors is why, who in business communication, what kind of level does one have to discuss communication with? If it's a hierarchical company, perhaps you have to speak with someone higher up the hierarchy with more power. Perhaps if it's more of a Swedish-style company where decisions are made communally, you can speak to another person of a different level. Where is communications undertaken for business? Is it appropriate to communicate in an email request for a business deal or a meeting? Is it not appropriate in certain contexts, if you take Greece or southern states? Generally, one has to get to know people well before one can do business. Likewise in China, Russia. I've been involved in business-related kind of university work in Russia, and believe me, it's wonderful because you go there and you treat it in the most incredible way. Wonderful dinners, drinks, sauna, just meeting people and getting to know them before you then sit down and actually do anything. Really very important. You can't expect to go somewhere like that and start doing business straight away. So where's important, and also when, the timing and the time of communication is important. Now, some of you may or may not know these organizations. These are, MG still exists, it's bought out by a Chinese firm. Rover as a brand name belongs still to Ford, but Rover and MG were large-scale British car manufacturers bought out by Nanjing Motors in, I think it was 2004 when they went bankrupt. So this was our last mainstream mass producer of vehicles. As I said, MG still made cars. Rover, the brand name, is owned by Ford because they used to own Land Rover, but the Chinese have come up with another brand name called ROV, which is the way that it's written in a way that Chinese people would say Rover. Anyway, bit of context. This company went bankrupt in 2004 and were aiming for a cash influx from Nanjing Motors. In actual fact, the deal went quite poorly for Rover and MG. And there's a plethora of reasons about that, many books written about it, but the reason I use it here is because I think the Rover guys, the British representatives there, misunderstood the communication model from a Chinese perspective. What allegedly happened was that the Chinese were wining and dining the British, and they decided that they would take them to a restaurant, feed them a lot of good food, a lot of vodka, and then negotiate. And because the executives at MG and Rover were on the back foot, they didn't quite understand that a trap had been set for them. It's a very smart way of doing business, but allegedly later they realised that the shots of vodka that were being offered around were being drunk only by the British, and the Chinese were not drinking them at all, or faking drinking them, or there was even some accusations that they'd been drinking water. They went to China to do this deal, as I said they wanted to, essentially create a joint venture. But the executive were able to manipulate them and to get them drunk, and then force them into a negotiation whereby they were just by now too drunk and too tired to actually communicate in the best way possible to get a deal. So one could argue, and some have historically speaking, that these firms died out in the UK, not just because of years of mismanagement, but because they couldn't get this joint venture, because of very skilled Chinese who were able to manipulate the lack of cultural understanding of the British executives who work there. Organising messages then, there are two ways essentially when you organising messages. You can have the direct or the indirect plan, very much linked to the context issue, high and low context. The direct plan is something that is said outwardly and very explicitly. The indirect is less so. If I might give an example momentarily, if I'm communicating with people, colleagues in Sweden, then I tend to have more of a direct plan. That is, you say, dear Lars, thank you for your email, following the correspondence, I would like to do X, Y, Z, thank you very much, blah, blah, blah. Indirect plan is more when I communicate with my French colleagues, so I say, dear sir, I'm hoping that the weather in beautiful La Rochelle is well and that you're enjoying life in the spring in France, and I'm also writing with reference to your email, you see the point. So there is some connection to the low and high context cultures there. Why is it important? Well, it takes some time for those with indirect plan style communication to adapt to direct, and it can often seem rude and abrasive. It still happens to me now that I read emails from Swedish colleagues, and I don't say they're abrasive, they're not abrasive, but I perceive them as such sometimes because there's no, what in English we call niceties. How are you? Hope the family are well. What a terrible crisis we're going through. There's none of that, it's just straight to business. So for a person used to indirect plan, direct plan can seem abrasive. For a person used to direct plan, an indirect plan can just seem pointless. You know, you would maybe say as a Swede, why are you asking me about the weather? Why are you asking me about my family? That's an invasion into privacy. I just want information from you. So it's about adapting to that. And by the way, Sweden and Britain aren't that far away in terms of this. So you have to bear in mind the high versus low context issue as well, because you know, in Japan or China, perhaps you write a whole half paragraph before you get to the point, talking about how beautiful the weather is and how the ice has disappeared and how the general aroma of flowers is there and how fragrant it is. So it's important to bear that in mind, and likewise the communication models, because these things matter to people. You know, if you go somewhere as a Swede, if you go to Stockholm to do business and they just take you out and get you drunk, you might be frustrated because you just want to get the deal done and get home. Well, likewise, if you went to Athens and just wanted to get the deal done and get home, the Greeks would be unlikely to do the deal if you weren't willing to spend time getting to know them. Organising persuasive messages and argumentation and an extension is communication. There are, in rough terms, three types of argumentation and logic. Western persuasion logic, which is linear, we've talked about that before. It is an attempt to rationalize an argument, to have a connection between each of the points and say, well, there are three reasons why you should buy my product. It's great value, great quality, and we have a great reputation. And then you extend upon those points and summarize, bringing them together. That's how you'll write your term paper, actually, in this Western persuasion logic. East Asian persuasion logic is more colorful, less direct. Remember the yin and yang, there needs to be a balance, so that's less linear in that sense. And apparently Arabic persuasion logic is very much about the elegance of the language. So there's a metaphor that says that an Arab man's tongue is his horse, and it should be something that you can use to create beautiful prose or things of linguistic value with. Persuasion tactics. There is the moral high ground, which is when you kind of say, well, I'm trying to persuade you because this is the right thing to do, and that might be based on sustainability or whatever else. Disadvantaged party in international relations, that's a tactic too that is frequently used in the developing world, that people argue that, well, we're poor because of the West and we don't have the money that you do, and therefore you should help us because of the morals and the fact that you have made us poor, whatever. And then of course these emotions, and these are more or less likely to be used by different people of different backgrounds, and so they're worth reading about and making sense of. Organising unwelcome messages, communicating about problems. Again, this might be something to bear in mind with the high and low context thing. Some cultures don't really communicate problems, and likewise some don't say no. So there are countless examples in business culture papers and in the book of people, particularly from the Western world, going to somewhere like Japan and believing that they've got a deal. You go to negotiate a deal, a joint venture or a sale of some kind, and you don't ever get met with the word no, you get met with the word yes, but yes is a conditional yes. It's more of a will see, and in fact they want to say no. So some people won't actually say no, and in particular, in general terms, that would equate to Eastern people from the Far East, who really are so polite and so context bound that the no isn't something they'd want to say because they lose face as a consequence of saying it. Then we have the different ways of problem-solving messages. There's the storytelling, whereby in a high-context culture you might tell a story to try and indicate to someone the message you're trying to relay without telling them the direct way without relaying to them exactly what it is you want to say. So, there was a student once, a story of a student who didn't read the textbooks and miserably failed the exam. Might be my way of indirectly, in a storytelling fashion, telling one of you that you better get your arse in gear and do some work. Then there are analogies, things like you hear it all the time. The relationship between them began to thaw. He's my rock. This kind of thing. Analogies are also comparisons. I use those quite a lot in my lectures and in my explanations of things. So the kind of an alternative way of explaining it. And then, of course, we have bargaining, which those who did the previous course will be aware of. Bargaining discourse is not so common in Sweden, especially in established stores. I wouldn't go to MediaMarkt and start to bargain a deal there, whereas if I was perhaps in Turkey or India, there might be, or even Britain actually. I say even Britain because it's a northern European state, but even there you would have some kind of bargaining back and forth about the deal. The role and force of words or works, as is erroneously written here. The relative importance of encoding messages, again, it's a high context thing. How much do you need to encode the message? How explicit can you be? Of course, the thing to bear in mind in there is if you're too explicit with someone, you'll offend them, you'll upset them. And if you're not explicit enough, then they won't understand. So it's very difficult when dealing with that kind of challenge. The role of words, as I said, in Arabic culture, they need to be incredibly articulate and they need to be almost poetic in their nature, apparently. I wouldn't know myself, I don't speak Arabic, but so I've read. The role of words in Japanese culture, very specific, very elegant too, but very succinct. And the role of words in English-speaking cultures. English has many synonyms and there are words that in different countries who speak English, words can be used in different ways. So there are examples all the time when my colleagues will say, is this a British word or an American word? So if you go to the bathroom and wash your hands, the thing you turn on is called a tap in England, whereas it's called a faucet in the United States. And the thing is that the tap is something underneath the sink that you turn the water on and off with. So these things can be confusing. But generally it's quite broad because so many people speak it, as is Spanish, as is Mandarin. Then channels of business messages, internal channels for written messages, external channels for written messages are important to bear in mind, and which ones to use are important. Structured behavioural channels, and as well as oral channels, when is it appropriate to use them? Different cultures have different ways of dealing with this, and voicing one's opinion in a meeting, for example, in Sweden, even if you're a junior employee, would be perfectly appropriate. Whereas in a Japanese company, perhaps it takes many years until you're authorized to make such a statement. And likewise, the style, should it be formal or informal, hierarchical or horizontal? In German and French and Spanish and Russian and I'm sure other languages, they have two words for you. So they have tu or vu or sie or du and so on and so forth. Likewise in Sweden it used to be du and ni, but that's changed. But it's really imperative that in certain cultures one is formal. So I remember years ago I was in Germany at a conference and I referred to, after several drinks bought by the professor for our group of academics, I referred to the professor as Herr Gemunden instead of Professor Herr Gemunden and Professor Herr Dr. Gemunden rather. He wasn't very happy with me, even though it was 11 at night and we were pissed. There's also the issue of framing messages. Often we have framed psychologically. So, what is the principal outcome that I want for this? Is it about a fair negotiation or a fair discussion? Is it about some kind of underlying principle of sustainability or whatever else? Messages are often framed within that and therefore need unpacking. And if people have different frames, then it's challenging for them to communicate. And clearly different cultures will bring with them a variety of different frames. And even if the two frames are similar, from the specific context, if it's a moral question, a Japanese versus a Swede might have very different views of what moral is. So these are things that need to be borne in mind and are difficult. Then we have non-verbal business conventions and face-to-face encounters. Some of these I've touched upon. They're kind of fun, I think. I like to put them in the introduction as well, but we'll look at them. So eye contact we've talked about. Eye contact is generally considered in the West as a sign of honesty, but it can also be invasive. So you wouldn't want to go to China and stare someone in the eyes because the eyes are considered the windows of the soul and it would be quite intimidating. So that's something to bear in mind. And then we've also talked about the smiling and the showing of anger. What I didn't talk about was something that my friend and colleague Sujit will discuss from an Indian perspective, and that's head movements. I shan't spoil it because he does it so wonderfully amusingly. Basically head movements can mean different things in different countries, so I shan't spoil that. There's also the use of arm movements. If you go to somewhere like Italy or Greece, people are very kind of prolific in terms of communicating with their arms, and that to some extent is just part of their culture. I do it a little bit too. Not everyone would stand here doing as I do, and it doesn't particularly mean anything as you move your hands around, and whenever you talk about this to a group of people, you always become so conscious of the fact you're moving your hands. But the way that people move their arms is often different in different countries, and that can sometimes be a bit intimidating for people, because often it seems to me the warmer the climate, the more vividly people move their arms around. And there's a posture sometimes different as well. The way that you kind of stand can also demonstrate different elements of communication which can differ across cultures. I think we've talked about this as well, the timing in spoken exchanges. If you're in the Middle East, I've spent some time there. I got a job in Oman a number of years ago. I never took it in the end, but when you're having the interview, you're speaking and you'll be spoken over, and there's a board of people who will do that. That's just part of their culture. They're a very talkative, friendly people, so therefore they'll talk over you instead of this back and forth style that we have in Northern Europe. And what of the emphasis on equal status? What of the emphasis on seniority and hierarchy? In some cultures it would be incredibly rude to speak over someone if they're of a higher hierarchy or senior to you. And of course there's also the issue of the inequality with related to women, where men perhaps ought to be heard more frequently and listened to more than women. And then there's the touching issue. I think we touched upon this too. The extent to which people will touch each other. There's also physical distance. If you find yourself in the Middle East, you'll observe that people tend to stand a bit closer than they would do in Sweden. Just the nature of the people who are there, they're just very warm people and very communicative. And likewise, as I've said before, with Greeks, French, Spanish, they tend to embrace one another and be much more physical. And I think it's important to know that, if you're especially having a conversation as a Swedish man with a Spanish girl, she might well touch you without really meaning anything sexual. But if that was in a Swedish context and the girl was touching your hand or your arm, then there would clearly be something there. Now, we're talking about organisations, not sex, but the reality is that people are people, and so therefore in a work context, people would be far more tactile in southern states than they would in northern ones. Further cultural rules for establishing relationships, signals of respect, ways of denoting respect. In an Anglo-Saxon sense, the handshake is very common. It's common elsewhere. But the angle of approach with the handshake is very important in England. So if you go in with one of these, generally be considered to be a bit of a prat, but at the same time, if you're a CEO or you want to dominate someone, the idea is that the hand kind of dominates the other. But it's also a sign of humility if you offer your hand like this, or it's a sign of equality if you offer your hand like that. There's also the dress, the extent to which people dress and demonstrate. It might be a military sense that you wear a certain uniform, or that you wear an expensive suit or an expensive dress as a woman. And how, I missed to say the second one, but how are positions of authority regarded? In Sweden it's perfectly reasonable for you to call me Chris, or if you met the dean of the business school, to call her Sophia. That wouldn't be acceptable in Germany, certainly wouldn't be acceptable in Latin America. You'd be in grave trouble were you to do that in Latin America, and especially the further the hierarchy one goes, then that behaviour would be very much considered very disrespectful. The power distance and symbols of power and authority can be demonstrated by the tone and behaviour of power and authority. This very much linked to leadership research, and that some of you've looked at. How do leaders speak? How do leaders act? And so on. Language is a symbol of power and authority. We've touched upon the different forms, the polite forms of using the word "you" in different languages. There's also the use of titles. So it's rather common in much of the world that titles are used, and that people with a title would expect their title to be used, and that people would be addressed as sir or madam in the relative languages. And there are also the family and societal structures as indicators of power. So, the family organisations that exist in Italy and South America, for example, and the way that power is demonstrated is quite different from Sweden, where Jantelager and lagom rule is very similar, by the way, in New Zealand, where they have something called the tall poppy syndrome, where you're not supposed to shine too brightly. And I know people in Sweden who are quite comfortable financially and go for example, cars that aren't too flashy when they could easily afford expensive ones. In some countries it's the reverse. You can't really afford it, but you buy it to try and show your wealth and demonstrate you have some power. In other countries you buy what you can afford. And so understanding this is important. And then we come to assertiveness versus peacekeeping. To what extent is it important to stand up for your own rights? Some cultures, they're more individualistic, are very much about that. United States, for example. Some are more about just preserving harmony. So you swallow that. You don't want to lose face by confronting someone. You merely accept that that's been said and don't speak out loud about it. Then we come to recognition of performance. And this is also something to bear in mind culturally. Some people in some countries are motivated by money, or non-monetary rewards, or a bit of both. Most research seems to think that people are to some degree motivated by both, but the proclivity towards that is different. It's interesting to me, in Sweden people tend not to talk about money so much. In Britain it's a lot about how much people earn, but then the reverse is true here, that these things are usually available to people. So as an academic, for example, working for the government, my salary is public information. Whilst I don't really talk about it and people don't really talk about money, the information is public, whereas in the UK it's the opposite. People talk about it, but the information isn't public. And so, the proclivity of people to discuss these things and to be motivated by them is quite high. It strikes me that in Sweden it's very much a consequence of the social democratic legacy, that people don't really discuss money because they think, well, that's enough, or it's crass to do that. At home it's very much about how much money people earn. Very much so, I think a little too much, but that's just the case. Then the nature of business information. We've sort of touched upon this with secondary and primary info in the past, the soft versus hard. Criteria for business information. To what extent is business information verifiable? To what extent and how how is it perceived to be trustworthy, how accurate is it, how credible is it. If you take, and I say this not to be disparaging against anyone who's Greek, because I love Greece, but you know, from the point of view of the culture there, their entry into the EU and so on, perhaps the government, on a governmental level, they're not particularly verifiable, trustworthy, accuracy or credible. It's interesting to me, you know, the level, how far people will go with these things in Sweden, because probably a lot of information is public, so it has to be all of the above, and people expect it to be. But it also means and reflects to some extent how trustworthy Swedes are, or rather, correctly, how trusting people are, how much trust there is in society. Well, the very fact I'm in the university now, I mean, I'm an employee, it's different, but you could have been here during normal term time. No university in Britain would allow students to be there at any time with a card. That wouldn't work. There isn't that level of trust in society. So that's something that needs to be considered and reflected on as well. And then source of information is formal and informal, of course, and you know, how much information can you trust from formal and informal sources. Then there's the process of decision making, which some of you know a great deal about, making decisions based on the ends, making decisions based on the means. So one is basically about making a decision that is best in terms of what happens at the end. The other is about making a decision based on how the decision is made. I would suggest that an example of Britain and Sweden again would be that in Britain it's probably more focused on the end rather than the means. In Sweden it's a lot about the means. I think that all decisions probably, culturally speaking, are made on both elements, but again it's a grey scale. But fundamentally it's very important in Sweden, it seems to me, to have communal decision making, and for people to see that, well, I've been able to say something, even if I had nothing to say, or the thing that I did say was ignored, I was able to say something, so the means was important. Whereas other people, probably linked to hierarchy as well, are more concerned on what the decision is at the end, rather than how it was made. And finally then, problem solving and conflict resolution. Communicate about conflict, so listening sincerely, expressing agreement where you can. The ideal solution to solving a conflict would be as follows. Identifying common goals, explaining your position, identifying resolutions that accommodate cultural priorities. This is an ideal situation that one would find oneself in were one to have a conflict interculturally. But of course, you can lay over the top of that all of the concepts and things that we've discussed, and hopefully you're reading about by now, to see just how complex cultural communication is and how great the proclivity for conflict within it can be. Okay, hope that was of some use and that you have learnt something. Keep reading, keep liking, subscribing, commenting, and thanks for your attention. Good luck with your work, and